I'm Janine Sijan. I am the sister of Captain Lance Sijan. Lance and I were 12 years apart, which meant that he really stood in for me as a father figure. So he has been my guiding light for a long time. Lance was an Air Force Academy graduate in 1965, and at that time, the Vietnam War was escalating, as we know. So Lance left in July of 1967 to go to Vietnam. He was on his 52nd mission on November 9th, 1967. He sent us a tape recording before he went up, and he said, "This is a routine mission, we're just taking out a bridge." And what actually happened to him that night, they released the ordnance, the bomb, and there was a faulty fuse in that bomb which they were not aware of, and it exploded less than a second away from the aircraft, engulfing the aircraft in flames. When he ejected, the ejection ripped off his helmet and his first aid kit. He got hung up in the trees, and he cut himself down and just crashed to the limestone karst below, which was in the jungle. He passed out, and when he regained consciousness, he assessed his injuries. He had broken hands. His right hand was broken so badly it was laying on the top of his arm. And the worst injury was a compound fracture to the left leg. 4 inches below the knee, bone snapped off sharp, protruding through the skin. Imagine that the limestone karst is like shredded glass. It's so sharp that as he was dragging himself backward through the jungle with his elbows pulling himself, his body was just being shredded. On Christmas Day, 1967, he passed out on a road. 210 pounds, 6'2" Lance had been diminished to 60 pounds. 80% of his body was open wound. As he would lay unconscious, the rats would cover his body and devour the flesh. Unconscious on the road, the Viet Cong picked him up and took him to a temporary holding camp. They transported him to another camp that was a prison, and they brought in 2 more downed pilots, and they were across from him, Guy Gruters and Bob Craner. They could hear this interrogation and this torture across the corridor. Bob Craner was the commanding officer at that point, and he yelled over across to Lance, not knowing who Lance was, "Just give them any information. You can't take these tortures." And Lance said, "No, it's against the code." The guard asked the 2 airmen to take Lance out back to a stream to clean him up. They said, "He stinks." As Guy and Bob approached where Lance had been kept, they opened the door, and Guy said he thought it was a child. It was just skeletal. Lance said, "Guy, is that you?" And Guy Gruder said, "Yes, who are you?" And he said, "It's me, Lance Sijan." Guy and Lance had been in the same squadron at the Air Force Academy, the 21st Squadron. And Guy, to this day, said it broke his heart. This 6'2", 210-pound football player from the Air Force Academy was diminished to nothing, a shadow of a man. The prisoners were very valuable. Trading tools, bargaining tools. They didn't want them to die, but they wanted to have them become just short of death. The torture that the Vietnamese would use would be, they would seat the POW on the ground, and they would pull their shoulders back and tie their wrists and tie their elbows, then rotate those arms over their head to break them out of their shoulders. Then they would tie them, their wrists to their ankles, and then they would pull them up on a hook and beat and beat and beat them. To which Lance would say, "I can't, it's against the code." Lance lost consciousness probably about January 17, 18, and he was not speaking any longer. There was standing water in the cell, and so Lance began to contract pneumonia on top of all the injuries he already had. On January 21st, he sat up, and in the loudest, strongest voice, he had had since they had been with him. He called out and he said, "This is it. It's over. Dad, where are you? I need you." With that, the other two prisoners pounded on the prison door, asking for the guards to come and help him. When they came, they took him away. The next day, they came back and they said, "Sijan died. He spent too long in the jungle." That was January 22nd, 1968. Lance's resiliency, his honoring the code, never putting others in harm's way. In Lance's dying moments, he did not call out in hatred. He called out in love. I often talk about this being Lance's legacy as a love story that happened to take place in a time of war.